Sit down. Ready? Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you back to our second day at the TESOL convention and our second day in the Electronic Village and Tech Showcase. And we also are in A315 if you're also interested in other sessions. I'm Christine Sabier, and I am the current chair for Call IS, 2 more days. And this morning we're starting our third hot topic session. The way we will process, we were supposed to be 4 speakers, but 2 speakers couldn't come due to visa problems. So the time slot for each speaker will be 30 minutes. If they choose to take up the 30 minutes. They will present one after the other, and then we'll open the floor up to Q&A. I also need to tell you that this is being webcast, so after the presentation, we will put up the link for you to be able to see this on YouTube. As soon as the session is over, it'll be up on YouTube forever. So welcome to the session, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, our first speaker this morning is Joshua Antle, and he is working in Japan at Syeda University. He will be discussing online vocabulary depth tests for new general service list words. Welcome, Joshua. You need to stand here and always be in front of the monitor.
Okay, thank you. We have some simultaneous interpreters working in the front row, so please don't think they're rude if they're speaking during my presentation. They're just doing their jobs. Well, the title of my presentation is an online vocabulary depth test for new general service list words. And since I'm not really pressed for time, I thought I'd start by explaining why I became interested in this particular topic. During my PhD, I studied collocations, which are chunks of language, and I believe that's an excellent way for language learners to improve their spoken fluency. In my teaching context in Japan, in the EFL teaching context, the learners usually have a large vocabulary, but their spoken proficiency is not as high. So that's what I wanted to address within my research. And I believe vocabulary depth is a great way to improve both spoken fluency. Okay. So today, first of all, I'm going to talk about the difference between what's called depth and breadth of vocabulary knowledge. Okay. Then I'll discuss some different vocabulary tests which have been made in the past. Then I'm going to discuss the test that I made, well, my friend and I made, the online vocabulary test. And then after that, I'll talk about some future tests I'd like to make. Okay. First of all, vocabulary depth and breadth are different aspects of vocabulary knowledge. Vocabulary breadth is similar to the number of words a learner would know. And vocabulary depth is how well each word is known. So, for example, there's many different aspects of vocabulary knowledge, such as frequency, how often a word occurs in the language, its meanings, its limitations, syntactic behavior, form, and associations. Associations are the words with which a given word is used. So, like I was saying, in my teaching context, a lot of the learners have a very wide vocabulary breadth. They know a lot of words, but they usually know one meaning for each word, and a lot of times they're not able to use it in spontaneous conversation. Okay. Now, if you were to test vocabulary breadth, you would use tests similar to this. Perhaps a simple translation text where you're given a sentence and then one of the words within the sentence is highlighted and then you translate that word into the L1. Okay, this would be a vocabulary breadth test. Another example is this yes-no test, okay, where the learners just go through a list of words and they just check yes or no whether they know the words. In tests such as these, there's often nonsense words, which is the third word on the test there. And this is to see if the test taker is overestimating their ability, if they're just checking yes to many words when in fact they don't know them. So the nonsense words are useful for that. So if a test taker says that they understand these words, then they're probably overestimating their ability for other words. Okay, and this is a third vocabulary breadth test where the learner would match the meaning with some of the target words. So for this particular example, end or highest point would be the tip, 6. So they're given a choice of 6 words and then 3 definitions, and then they have to try and match the definition to the target word. Okay. So all of those are different versions of a vocabulary breadth test. Okay. Now, vocabulary depth tests are a little more difficult to construct because you're testing productive knowledge, which is a little more difficult to do. So here is one of the examples below. So every working person must pay income, and then there's the blank. Now, for these tests, it's quite common to give the very first letter, and we do that to avoid, so we're trying to create a test which only has one possible correct answer. So that's why the T is given, and it's tax. Other times, you have to give more letters, as in the second one. The pirates buried the treasure on a desert island, but given the context of the sentence, there's many possible answers if you had only given T. So in this case, since the targeted word was treasure, we had to provide more letters. So this is probably the most common version of a vocabulary depth test. Okay. Now, another one is the word association test. This is quite different. This was made by Reed in 1998. Now, for this test, you're given a target word, and then following the word are 8 word associates. So, for example, in this first one, it's beautiful is the target word. And from the 8 following words, you're supposed to select 4 which associate with the target word of beautiful. So why don't I just give you a second, since we're not pressed for time, if you'd like to try and do the test just yourselves, and then I'll tell you the answers. It's actually quite difficult. Okay, so I'll just tell you the answers now, and don't worry if you get some wrong. Actually, I had to carefully go through them, and I made a couple mistakes when I took this test myself. So, for beautiful, it was enjoyable, face, music, and weather were the associations. Enjoyable was the one I had trouble with. Bright was clever. Shining, color, and happy. Okay. And general was usual, whole, idea, reader were the associations for that one. So it's actually quite a difficult test, and the associations can be of 2 different types, like synonyms, like for example, bright and clever, or words which go together. Maybe a general reader. So there's 2 different ways you can think of associations. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about my test. When I was doing my master's, I learned about what was called the General Service List at the time. And I thought it was this was a great step forward in language education. The General Service List was a list of about 2,000 words which learners should know based on the frequency they're used. And it was made in 1953 by Michael West. And then in 2013, Brown, Culligan, and Phillips made what's called the New General Service List. And it's basically a much better version of the original list. And it's 2,800 lemmas, or similar to word families, but that are very highly frequent in English. These 2,800 words account for about 92% of the words spoken in general English. So it's a great target for language learners. These are the words that I strongly believe the language learners should learn first, because they represent such a large portion of the English which is spoken and in newspapers and on TV. Okay. Now, I want to develop a different version of a vocabulary depth test. So basically, I went through a series of steps. Okay. First was to plan the test, and then create items, then edit them, pilot them, analyze them, select them, revise, and then examine consistency and validity. It's actually quite a time-consuming process. It has many steps. And the aspects of vocabulary depth knowledge, which I particularly wanted to investigate, was idioms. Okay. And I'm going to just click out of my PowerPoint presentation for a second. And this paper by Liu was very influential. He created a corpus of spoken American English, and he identified what the most common idioms were in spoken English. But before we go further, it's important to note that idioms such as "it's raining cats and dogs" is kind of probably the most common meaning sense for idioms. But those idioms are actually not very frequent in English. They're not used as often as we might expect, so they're probably of lesser importance to our language learners. So Liu devised different categories for idioms. So pure, which are "it's raining cats and dogs," "kick the bucket," things of that nature. But those, again, are not very common. Then the semi-literal ones, where the meaning is a little difficult to interpret based on the individual words, and then literal idioms as well, okay, which are the most common. And within this list, he includes phrasal verbs like take out, pick up, things of that nature. So his final list had 3 different bands. Band 1 are the idioms that occur most frequently in American spoken English. And these are used 50 or more times within 1 million words in the corpus, which is actually a very high frequency, 50 occurrences in 1 million words. And then he has band 2, which is between 11 and 49, and band 3, which occur the least frequent, between 2 and 19. I think there's a typo there somehow. I don't think the bands overlap like that, so I'm assuming it's 20 to 49 for band 2. But okay, sorry, I'll show you the bands right now. So you can take a quick look. So these are what we call the most common idioms in the English language. Kind of, sort of, get into. And you can see that there are more of the phrasal verbs are quite common. Literal idioms are quite common in this band. And if anyone wants a copy of this paper, I can give it to them after the presentation. So when I read this paper, I thought that this is a great resource for my students. I was thinking this is the type of language that I want to teach them. In an EFL context, explicit instruction is needed because our students are not exposed to English outside of the classroom as much as ESL students who have to live their daily lives. In an ESL environment, I think word list and explicit instruction becomes less important because students are exposed to the words naturally. And since these are such high frequency words, that they are very likely to encounter them many times just throughout their daily lives. But in the teaching context I work in, basically we have the students in class, and that's where we have to improve their English, and we have to explicitly teach them these kinds of words, because if they do go to a foreign speaking or like an English speaking country, they'll need to know these words because they're so frequent. Okay. So I'm just going to describe the steps I went through. Okay. So first, I created the test items, and that was based on the Liu's article. So how I did that is I chose 44 words from each band, 44 from band 1, 44 from band 2, and 44 from band 3. I randomly selected them. And then I created the test items. So my goal when creating the test item was to create enough context within the prompt that the students would be able to complete the idiom. Okay. And also, I had to make sure that when I was giving the very first letter of the missing word, that there was no alternative answers. So that was the first step, to create 132 test prompts and the close gaps. Then my research partner, he looked over my list, and then we went back and forth in that way. So sometimes he'd say, I don't think there's enough context for this question, or this question has several possible answers, and we would go back. And I'll show you how I addressed each of those. Okay. And then I would adjust the questions. So for example, one of the comments he made is, this is the prompt I made. Can you out the old newspapers? They will pick them up tomorrow. I was trying to make take out. That was the target idiom from the list. But my research partner said, oh, you could also use throw out in that context. So basically, I just added an A, and then that addressed that issue. Okay. Then what I did is I had to check all the prompts and all the questions against the new general service list. I wanted to make sure that every word within the test was also within the first 2,880 words, which is the amount of words on the new general service list. So I used a tool called Lexitutor, and it's very easy to use. You just copy your text, paste it in, and it gives you a word analysis, how frequent each of the words are. And if you're interested in this sort of research, this is a great tool to use. I highly recommend it. Okay. Then the next step was to remove idioms. Like I said, these idioms are very common in English. So when I was actually making the test prompts, without noticing it, I was actually using answers from other questions within my text prompts. So, for example, this one, he kind of took over the entire conversation. He didn't give anyone else a chance to speak. Without knowing it, I used kind of, which is one of the idioms. So I had to change that to completely. He completely took over the conversation. Okay. And then the next step was to give it to native speakers. So my research partner and I, we gave the test to 3 British native speakers who went through the test and tried to do the same thing, finding if there was a lack of context or if there were any alternative answers. And then they gave us comments and we adjusted accordingly. Okay, and then finally, the students took the test. I had 61 students take the test so far. Okay, and then we did some statistical analysis on the results. I'm not sure how interested you are on this side of it, but basically we used a rash analysis which identifies both test takers, which are outliers. They're not following a pattern, and also test items, which are acting in an unnormal way. So I'll show you some examples of those. Okay. So, for example, question 104. I'm sorry, I didn't want to tee up so much of your time. This question was surprisingly easy, even for low-level students. 104 actually is a question from Band 3, so it should have been more difficult. And my research partner and I think it's just because take is such a common word that a lot of low-level students guessed it. So this one actually acted very abnormally. Low-level students answered it correctly more often than high-level students, whose knowledge might actually have gotten in the way of that one. They had so many other possibilities for that gap that they answered it incorrectly, where a low-level student just took a wild guess and was able to answer it correctly. So that item is not very useful for my test, and it will be removed in the future versions. And then also, question 21 was pretty easy. Okay. There was also the other end of the spectrum where some of the questions were more difficult. So for this one, for 46, we should go over our presentation one more time. That was quite a difficult one for the students. Okay. And then the last one was very, very difficult. So the answer is supposed to be follow-up, but very few students got that correct. So it's actually probably too difficult. But either way, we used a rash analysis to identify both the questions and the test takers who were not behaving, outliers, and they get removed from the data. Okay. So, and that left me with, so we have about 128 or 126, something like that, questions left. And what we're going to do is we're going to split them into two different tests. We're going to check reliability and validity, which right now is quite, the statistical scores for that are quite high. And we're going to make two versions of the test for research purposes. So they can be used as a pre-test, post-test if a researcher wants to investigate this way. I'm sorry, I couldn't call up the actual test, but if anyone is interested, I can give you, I can send you a paper version of the test. I can give you a soft file or send you a link, whichever you'd like. And just to finish my presentation, two versions of future vocabulary depth tests I'd like to make are delexicalized verbs and polysmiths were nouns and their collocates. So this would be an example of a test for polysmy, where you have to choose the associations which work best. So for example, for work, which is a very common word in English, but it has different meaning senses, you could do social work and hard work, but it's very uncommon for someone to say right work or spare work. So for this question, the answer would be social and hard. Okay. And delexicalized verbs are also an aspect of vocabulary depth. Okay, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Judith Olalen, and she will be discussing choosing and using electronic picture books in the elementary ESL classroom. Again, she will have 30 minutes to speak, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. Okay, let's start the show.
Hi, good morning. This is kind of the opposite end of what you've been watching. This is about young learners. And this is some things that are now becoming very prevalent in working with young learners, both as teachers and having parents work with young learners to read with them. So this is about using and choosing electronic picture books. So the first piece of this is before you're really thinking about using picture books with a young learner, whether you're a tutor, a teacher, or you're training parents to work with young learners, you have to know a little bit more about the young learner. The young ESL or even EFL learner is a very physically active child. They're very spontaneous. They often enjoy speaking out. They're not afraid to express their opinions. They're curious about all kinds of new ideas. They enjoy make-believe and interesting stories that are about make-believe. They have very short attention spans. They are very egocentric. They're centered on their own, what surrounds them and what connects with their own thinking and their own experiences. So stories have to connect with them based on their own personal experiences, things that they're interested in, so picking stories that are really far away from their central ideas and experiences really don't resonate with them. They're very social, so these electronic picture books really connect with them in terms of working with a partner through a story or working with their parent. And they learn by doing and interacting. So that's kind of the basis for what you're looking for in young learner books. And so what I did here was I looked at these characteristics and what good storybooks should possess. So they're curious. You want to move from known vocabulary to unknown to help them learn new words. They have very short attention spans. They love make-believe. They like connecting things to their own lives. So it should be very highly visual, and the words and the pictures should connect totally with them. They're physically active, so the storybook should also provide opportunities for movement, whether it's drag and drop, scan across the page, or even stop and talk and do before they move on to the next page. They like new ideas, and so repetition of words and sentence patterns that expand on these new ideas. And you'll see one example that I'll show you a little later about remember and forget in different contexts. So what I have to remember in my daily life and what I might forget each day. So these also have to connect to their home experiences, their home cultures, and sometimes that's a little bit more difficult to find related to their home cultures, but if you look for more generic storybooks, they will connect generally, like shopping or getting ready for school or getting ready for bed, things like that. Okay, so when you think about cognitive theory using multimedia, children learn better when there's pictures and words connected together, not just words alone. And so when reading with a child, you need to have pictures that connect directly to what's on the current page of the story rather than what's happening in the future or what happened already, so that they make that connection in the storybook. Here's the words, and here's the picture that goes along with it, and I see a match. So look down at the bottom of this slide, and you see Little Critter. So Little Critter in this particular page is talking about brushing his teeth. He remembers to brush his teeth before he goes to bed. So everything on that page is connected to remembering. The picture cues have very clear narration, and the vocabulary has built-in dictionaries in a really good quality picture book. The sound effects enhance comprehension. You'll see this slide a couple of more times, this little critter brushing his teeth. But just so you know, when you click on this and he starts to brush his teeth, and he talks about remembering to brush his teeth, you hear the sound effects of brushing his teeth. Throughout the story, too, there's also always a connection to some other animal involved. In this particular series, Little Critter has a mouse, or he has a spider, who do many of the same things that he does. Here's a good picture book for how Rocket learned to read. It's also a paper book and an online picture book, and it gives you the opportunity for to be read to. Your child can listen to it totally. So one time around, it can be read to the child, and then the child can then read it by himself and stop at points to talk with either the parent or the teachers. And then there are extras. A good multimedia picture book also has a dictionary, will have games, will have a pronunciation guide, but all should be connected to the book itself and the story. Here's another one, A Day in the Market. In this one, you have the option of multiple languages. The story can be told in various languages, and I'll show you in a little while a game that goes along with it. So this is also a high-quality multimedia picture book. The one that I've been really focusing on recently a lot and looking at it in terms of, and I've just been working in Japan with graduate students who are preparing to teach English as a foreign language to young learners. And we looked at a number of these at Soka University in Hachioshi, and we looked at a number of these little critter books. And all of these little critter books are, they're by subscription, for one thing. You can buy a subscription for 3 months or 6 months or a year, or you can actually own all of the books and all of the new books that come out, and you can make that choice. Every month they offer one free book, so if you choose not to buy any of it, you always have the option of having a free book. So it can read to you, you can read it by itself, and it can just play through the whole story. Very honestly, I found the playthrough too fast for low intermediate English learners, so I would opt out of that until they were more able and to read. Okay, so one of the things you want to look at is, there are different ways that children interact with a picture book if you've got a paper book and you're holding it up and showing the pages than if you have an online book. The pacing can be different, and you have to look at the way the pacing is developed on the electronic picture book so that you know that it will meet the needs of the age and ability of your learners. The ebooks require different motor skills, so you have to swipe to change pages. Sometimes you have to look down at the corner of a page to find where you change the page. You have an option to drag and drop. You have an option to put your finger on a vocabulary word and listen to its pronunciation, and then stop and then maybe go back and listen to it 1 or 2 or 3 more times. So these options are really something that you have to teach the young learner. And actually, when you look around today, many of your preschoolers who have ability to look at, use iPads or borrow their parents' iPhones or whatever, they really have these skills already. The thing that's really a problem that you have to be aware of, and I'll show you an example, in a multimodal picture book, you may have something that will hijack the student away from the story to a different kind of activity that has absolutely nothing to do with the story, and I'll show you a little example in a little bit. In this way, you want to be careful of that it doesn't interrupt the story schema, the plot lines, or the vocabulary, and you want to make sure you have options for pronunciation. In this picture of Little Critter, he's with his mouse friend and his spider friend, and he said, "But there's one thing I never forget," and forget is highlighted, so you can click on it for pronunciation, and you can look at it for the meaning of what forget is. Okay. The dog in this picture has a little bird that reads with him, so images and sounds work together. He's really afraid of reading on his own, so his little bird friend shows him how easy it is to learn the vocabulary and learn how to read and how to pronounce words. And then at the end of the story, they read together. Actually, this is an award-winning book among young learners. Okay, so here again, here's Little Critter again brushing his teeth, so you'll hear of him brushing his teeth, and the toothpaste is falling on the floor, so you'll hear that sound as well. And so the sound effects play into an understanding of it. And if you've ever been with a 4-year-old, you know that this is a very typical picture. Brushing your teeth may become a really disastrous bunch. There'll be toothpaste everywhere. Okay. This is the one that hijacks. And it's interesting because these are Arthur stories, and they're really wonderful stories. However, in this picture, look at this story. It says, later, the delivery man brought a big box. In the mail, there were 3 birthday cards for Arthur. One was from Uncle Bud. When Arthur opened it, 3 dollar bills fell out. Well, that's absolutely fine. The dollar bills fall out on the floor. You hear them. That's connected to the story. But here are some other things that happen in this picture that really don't connect to the story. If you look at the chair, the red chair in the picture, and you click on it, it plays like a harp. Has absolutely nothing to do with the story. If you look in the cupboard, toast pops out of the toaster, the salt and pepper shaker dance. The box opens and closes, and that's connected. The clock on the wall changes from a happy face to a sad face. So you have about 50% that are related to the story and 50% that are really not related at all. And so if you're really working towards building story schema and understanding plot line and building vocabulary understanding, then you don't want to click on things that have nothing to do with how the story proceeds. This example, and it's right from the same story about Arthur's birthday, is connected to the storyline. So that night, Arthur told his parents about his plan. Early the next morning, Arthur and Francine's Arthur's kid sister, delivered their notes. The last note they delivered was a special one. Muffy is Arthur's very good friend. So first in the picture, this is after I clicked. You click on the mailbox opens, and you see the letter to Muffy, and you can read the letter and talk about why Arthur delivered a letter to Muffy to come about his birthday party. But there are other things which I didn't show you here that are hot spots that take you away from the story. Like you can turn the lights on and off in each of these houses. You can open and close the mailboxes. The fire hydrant can dance. So these are things that really don't connect. A day at the market, which I showed you earlier, which comes in multiple languages. Now this has an activity, a game that really goes along with the storyline, because the main character is going to the market to buy meat, vegetables, etc., fish, and so you have a drag and drop activity in which you sort the different things into categories, whether it's meat or fish or vegetables. And that really makes a connection to the story. So it's really important to really preview a story before you use it so that you know whether or not it's going to kind of drag kids away from the plot line and the vocabulary to maybe something that's cute and interesting but doesn't make a connection to what they're learning. And so in these pictures, I wanted to show you repeated frames because I thought that was really important. Little Critter's brushing his teeth here again. And every sentence here has to do with forget or remember. And so the repetition of forget, remember in present tense helps the student to see examples of things you remember, things you forget in your daily life. So, like Little Critter forgot to turn off the water in the bathtub, and so it overflowed. Did I forget to turn off the tub too? So you have a question. You have statements and you have questions for building the vocabulary. And what you can do with this too is after you walk out of the storybook, you can then have children do an activity. They can do a sort with the pictures from the storybook of things he forgot, things he remembered. They can do their own things I forget sometimes and things I remember through drawings and simple words. So they can just do 2 words, I forget, I remember, and put them together. So there's a good extension activity with the Little Critter materials. Rocket, how he learned to read, the bird words are the words that the bird teaches little Rocket, and see the bird on the tip of his nose? Rocket always looks very worried about learning to read. He's very afraid. He's in kindergarten and he won't ever learn to read. And then there's an alphabet drop for pronouncing different alphabet words and word blends for in games for Rocket. There are also games connected, and this is sort of a game, a vocabulary game. As you go through each of the Little Critter stories, in each picture frame, you have a number of things you can click on. And when you click on them, it gives you the name of the object. So there's Mom and Little Critter. She asked him to clean up his room. Obviously, he didn't listen. And Little Critter didn't clean up his room. And so I clicked on, just as an example for you, the picture in the picture, and it came up as picture. For each story, there are anywhere from 17 to 22 words that you will find. And they're not just introduced once, they're repeated often. So if you click, you can see his little mouse friend down in the right-hand corner trying to straighten up his room. So that provides a whole scenario of talking about cleaning up your room, and why is Little Critter's room a mess? He forgot, and a number of things you can click on. When you get to the end of the storybook, it tells you how many of the objects you found in the Little Critter story. And then in this case, how many of the objects the mouse found, and how many of the objects the spider found, and sometimes how many of the objects you, the reader, found. So you have the opportunity to go back over the story several times to learn how many words are there that you can add to your vocabulary. Okay, so one of the things I brought with me, and I think I have enough for everybody that's in this room, is I brought a handout for you, and if anyone who is not here or would like a handout and doesn't get one, my email address is at the end, and you can get a handout. So the handout contains a list of picture books that are available. It has my contact information, and then it also has with it references on big picture books online, and then in the end it has a checklist to look at and determine whether the picture book is appropriate. So what you're looking at are these categories. You're looking at animation and sounds. Is the animation appropriate for the picture book? Is the volume too loud or too soft? Or is it just right? Or are there a lot of distractions, such as music, while you're reading the story that takes away from the story? Music or sound effects. So sound is important. Volume is important. Being careful for not being too loud for young learners so that it's detrimental to their hearing. The hotspots that I mentioned earlier, how many hotspots are there? Are the hotspots appropriate to what they're reading? Do they connect to the storyline? Do they connect to building vocabulary? That's really important. Operability and page navigation. To tell you the truth, I think sometimes I read several of these and I wasn't the best of the navigators. So if you can't navigate it well, can a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old do a good navigation? So you want to make sure that they can. Are the features in this story, is the story appropriate for a young learner? If the learner is over 8 or 9 years old, is it appropriate? Maybe not. So you have to be really careful about, you're looking at emergent and early literacy. And the instructional design, does the content and the narration go together? Do the pictures and the content match? The ones I've shown you are good examples. Even the author books are good examples, except knowing in advance that the hotspots are really, you have to be careful about choosing your hotspots that are appropriate for the learner and appropriate for the story. So really, a chair that makes harp music in the middle of Arthur's kitchen or toast popping out of the toaster is not really appropriate to the whole thing about Arthur receiving birthday money. So you have to be really careful about that. And that's the end. This is me. I'm Judith O'Loughlin. My email's right there. If you want an electronic copy of the checklist, email me and I'll send it to you. This is my first draft of working on this checklist, and I'll probably play with it more as I look at more books. And feedback would be great about checklists for choosing appropriate, online. Some of these are on YouTube. Some of them are by CD. Some of them are apps. So there's more and more choices for picture books in this way. And you can pair it with many times you can pair it with actually a paper book from your school library or public library or purchased through Amazon or some other way. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. I like the checklist especially. So do we have any questions from the audience? For any of the speakers? Okay. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in other sessions. Let me give you the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel. You said it was on here? The YouTube channel? /call CALL hyphen IS hyphen YouTube YOUTUBE. Okay, so tinyurl.com/call hyphen IS hyphen YouTube. Thank you.